A medieval battlefield was a brutal place to be alive. Disease, filth, and terrifying weapons claimed countless lives. Let's find out more. What was it like to be an ordinary soldier in the Middle Ages? How did they fight their battles? And what was life like in medieval times? To answer these questions, we need only look at one of history's most famous battles, the Battle of Hastings in 1066. It took place in what is now southern England between the English army led by King Harold Godwinson and the Norman army led by William the Conqueror. The battle was a result of a succession dispute following the death of Edward the Confessor, the previous King of England. Both claimants had legitimate arguments, but ultimately it was William who would prevail, ushering in a new era in English history. The build-up to the battle was marked by political intrigue and military posturing. Then came October 14, 1066. The two armies met near Hastings. Harold's force numbered about 7,000 men while William's was smaller, comprising around 5,000 soldiers. We can only imagine the cacophony as both armies prepared for battle. The English were a mix of infantry, men on foot, and cavalry, men on horseback. Their weapons included swords, axes, and spears. Most were also armed with bows and arrows. The Normans too had infantry and cavalry, but many more of them were mounted archers. In other words, men on horseback who shot arrows using a bow. This gave the Norman army a significant advantage over the English. As the fighting began, the English formed a shield wall, a defensive formation designed to withstand attacks from the front. The idea was that if a charging cavalryman crashed into the shields, his momentum would be absorbed by the wall and he'd be unable to break through. However, this tactic didn't work against the Norman archers. Their arrows flew over the top of the shields and rained down on the English, but then something unexpected happened. A thick fog rolled in which saved the English. It allowed some of their soldiers to sneak up on the Normans and start stabbing them in the legs, killing many horses. Without their mounts, the Norman knights were vulnerable. So the English fought back against the knights and turned the tide of the battle. For a moment, it seemed the English might win, but then the fog lifted. As if by magic, the sun shone through the clouds, giving the Norman archers the visibility they needed to regroup and resume firing arrows. Harold fell, possibly killed by an arrow through his eye socket. Without their leader, the English lost their nerve in the battle. The carnage that followed was appalling. Thousands lay dead on the battlefield, their bodies mutilated, their limbs torn off, their skulls cracked open. The victors looted the corpses, stripping them of their armor and valuables. Then they left the rotting bodies where they lay, a grim reminder of the horrors of war. Life in medieval times was not easy, especially for those who fought in wars. Here are some of the things they had to endure. Dirty and diseased. Imagine being covered in dirt, sweat and blood, sleeping in your own filth. That was the daily reality of a medieval soldier. There were no showers or basic hygiene. Soldiers were often too busy fighting or preparing for battle to worry about cleanliness, but hygiene was important for another reason. If you were injured and didn't clean your wounds properly, you could get an infection, and if you did, you'd probably die. Terrifying weapons. Medieval soldiers had to contend with some truly terrifying weapons. Swords and axes were dangerous enough, but then there were the longbows. These were huge bows and arrows that could pierce the armor of a knight. And then came the trebuchet. This was a massive catapult used to hurl heavy objects like rocks and carcasses over a castle wall. Agincourt 1415. Henry V leads his English army into battle against the numerically superior French. But they're not prepared for what the weather has in store for them. We've all seen the iconic shots from Shakespeare's play. Henry V. Henry leading his troops into battle with a sword raised high above his head. The French king trapped on a tower with his queen by his side and the English longbowmen unleashing a volley of arrows into the French ranks. But it's all just theater. How did the real Battle of Agincourt actually go down? Join us as we look at the real story behind one of history's greatest battles. It's me, and you're watching this channel. In October 1415, an English force under the command of Henry V landed in northern France with the goal of retaking the city of Calais from the French. By the end of the month, they had managed to lay siege to the well-defended city. But after several failed attempts to take it, they were forced to abandon the siege and retreat back to England. But Henry was determined to salvage something from his campaign. He was hoping to find some unsuspecting French nobles who would make easy targets. The small English force, which by this point numbered no more than 8,000 men, made camp near the village of Agincourt on October the Bet. But when scouts returned from the area, they brought bad news. There were around 30,000 French soldiers only 6 miles away. Henry had two options: run or fight. Retreating wasn't really an option. Not only would it have disgraced the English, but the terrain was such that the retreating army would have been in danger of being outflanked by the pursuing French. They were also too close to the enemy to set up camp and get a good night's sleep, so they decided to risk it all and face their enemy in battle. But the English were badly outnumbered, 30,000 French versus 8,000 English. To add insult to injury, the French army was made up mostly of elite troops. There were 10,000 men-at-arms, heavily armored knights and foot soldiers who fought with swords and shields. Another 6,000 were longbowmen, an even deadlier threat than the men-at-arms. This didn't include any of the 14,000 unarmored levies, peasant farmers pressed into service who could become deadly with their pikes and valges, a medieval pole weapon with a hook on one end and a sharp spike on the other. And then there was the English force, made up of 2,000 men-at-arms, 6,000 longbowmen and 2,000 auxiliary troops with artillery and a small number of cavalry. While these numbers are hotly debated by historians, the general consensus is that the English were indeed outnumbered, but not nearly as badly as previously thought. For example, one historian estimated that the real number of combatants was between 12 and 15,000 English and 25 and 30,000 French. Still, the English were facing a sizable force, nearly double their own size, but Henry was confident he could win a battle even if his forces were outnumbered. For one thing, he had the element of surprise. The French were expecting him to retreat, and second, he had the longbow. It was so deadly that a skilled archer could kill a knight at up to 200 yards. And finally, he had his army with him, the most elite fighting force in Europe. At the time, the English army was a mix of veterans from the 100 Years' War and newly enlisted men who had answered Henry's call for troops. But they were well-trained, disciplined, and led by capable officers, and they knew exactly what was at stake. The English throne was still in dispute, and the war with France was a chance for Henry to prove himself as king. But while the English were well-trained and motivated, the same couldn't be said for their opponents. The French were a mix of professional soldiers and levies who had been taken from their farms and villages and forced to join the army. But they were poorly trained, undisciplined, and given little reason to fight. Many of them didn't even know why they were there, and morale was low. The royal commanders were more concerned with saving face than winning the battle, and overall, the French army was a disorganized mess. In fact, the French commander, Charles the Dauphin, never even intended to fight. He wanted to force the English into a battle, knowing that the French army would win easily, but the French were suffering from a serious case of... One of my favorite types of archaeology is the archaeology of mass graves. It's a subset of forensic archaeology that focuses on the recovery and analysis of human remains from mass grave sites. I first got interested in it when I took a course called Forensic Archaeology with Dr. Clyde Winters at the University of Tennessee. We examined a number of archaeological cases, including some that involved mass graves. One case in particular really stuck out to me. It was the case of the disappeared of Aidea. It's a series of mass graves from Argentina during the Dirty War period, which occurred between the late 1970s and the mid-1980s. During this time, thousands of people were kidnapped, tortured, and killed by the military regime. Their bodies were then thrown into mass graves. Today we're going to be talking about skulls, weapons, and trauma wounds associated with mass graves. If you've watched the video on my channel, then you know how often I talk about skulls. They're my favorite part of the skeleton, and they have so much information written all over them. In today's video, I am going to be showing you some skulls that were recovered from one of these mass graves in Argentina. These skulls come from an archaeological site known as Campo de Mayo, located about 30 miles northwest of Buenos Aires, Argentina. This was an Argentine army base used for clandestine activities during the Dirty War. This included torture and murder. The remains of at least 294 people were found buried in 5 mass graves on the grounds. The bodies had been wrapped in black plastic bags and buried in shallow, sometimes unmarked graves. In this video, I'm going to be looking at skull damage associated with 2 particular mass graves. 2 of the mass graves were excavated by archaeologists. In 2003 and 2005, I will refer to these as Grave 1 and Grave 2. Let us begin with Grave 1. We have 121 individuals represented in this mass grave, 103 adult and 18 children. Of those 18 children, moving on to Grave No. 2, this mass grave contained 69 individuals, 56 adults and 13 children. Once again, many of the bodies had been dismembered, and some had been burned. A total of 116 fragments of skull were recovered from this mass grave. Many of these fragments came from the same individual. It was a male, possibly in his 20s, who had been shot multiple times. There were 13 bullet entry and exit wounds across his skull. He had been shot in the forehead, the left parietal bone and the occipital bone, as well as multiple times on the left side of the skull. You can actually see where the bullet had passed through the skull and exited on the opposite side. Sometimes when people are shot, the bullet will ricochet inside the skull, damaging multiple areas. In addition to this male, there was also a female in this mass grave who had been shot multiple times. She had 2 gunshot wounds on the left side of her skull. An interesting observation from this grave was the number of ceramic fragments found within the brain tissue of several individuals. This could mean that the bodies had been disinterred sometime after they were initially buried. Grave robbing was common in Argentina during this time period, and people would exhume bodies to steal valuables such as jewelry or even to sell the body to medical schools. Some of these ceramic fragments may have been from the urns that the individuals were originally buried in. Other possibilities include bullets that had been repurposed as makeshift projectiles, or they could have just been pieces of pottery that were available and used as grave markers. The skull is the part of the skeleton that we tend to associate most with our identity. Being able to identify individuals using their skulls is incredibly important for the families of the disappeared. It allows them to get closure and to learn what happened to their loved ones. It also helps us understand who the victims were as individuals. Maybe they were someone who enjoyed wearing nice clothes or jewelry, or perhaps they were a parent who was carrying their child on their hip when they were killed. Their personal belongings can help us understand who they were as people. And in the case of the disappeared of Ayotzinapa, their stories can help us remember what happened during this dark time in history. There are a few different ways we can use skulls to identify individuals. One way is by measuring the skull and determining its overall shape. This is known as cranial morphology. Each population group has a unique cranial morphology based on a number of environmental factors. For example, people who live in colder climates tend to have larger, more robust skulls than people who live in warmer climates. Another method of identification is through cranial osteometry. This is the process of measuring the skull to determine its size and shape. This can be done by taking calipers and measuring various landmarks on the skull, such as the length, width, and height. These measurements can then be compared to a database of other skulls to determine where this individual falls within the range of variation. However, the most reliable method of identifying individuals using their skulls is through the use of cranial sutures. This is the process of examining the joints between the bones of the skull to determine the individual's age at death. As we age, our skulls go through a process called ossification. During ossification, the bones of the skull begin to fuse together. This starts in childhood and continues into adulthood. By examining the cranial sutures, archaeologists can determine the age of an individual at death with a high degree of accuracy. This can be especially useful in cases where the individual is unidentified, and there is no other way to determine their age. The age at death can help narrow down the possibilities and make the identification process easier. Additionally, the condition of the cranial sutures can provide insight into the individual's lifestyle. For example, individuals who lived a nomadic lifestyle or who were constantly on the move may have had more open sutures than individuals who lived a more settled lifestyle. I hope you learned something new today. If you want to learn more about the archaeology of mass graves, I recommend checking out the work of Dr. Clyde Winters, Dr. Margaret Cox, and Dr. Carolina N. The year is 1162 AD. You are an aspiring knight of King Richard the Lionheart's court. Your lord has just won a great victory against the infidel armies of Saladin. And to celebrate, the king is throwing a feast in your honor. This feast will last for 4 days and nights with non-stop drinking, singing, and celebration. It will be one of the greatest feasts in history. But it's not exactly the kind of feast that you were expecting. Join me as we explore the Knights' Victory Feast, a massive royal celebration of chivalry and courage. The knights have just returned from a successful crusade. The streets are lined with people cheering and celebrating. As the knights approach the city, their king, Richard the Lionheart, leads the procession. He is a legendary medieval warrior who has captured the hearts and minds of his people. The knights ride into town on their destrious, powerful war horses that have carried them into battle. Their armor is still bearing the scars of the recent fighting, but they are all the more glorious for it. The king is greeted by Queen Berengaria as he dismounts. She is a beautiful woman with long flowing hair and a regal bearing. She is the epitome of feminine beauty, and she is there to welcome her husband home. The king gives her a quick kiss on the cheek and then turns to address the crowd. He thanks his knights for their service and tells them that they have earned a great victory for God and for England. But the king is not content with just words. He wants to show his knights how much he appreciates them. That is why he has ordered that a great feast be held in their honor. The feast will last for 4 days and nights, and it will be filled with food, drink, and entertainment. There will be jousting tournaments, falconry displays, and even a mock battle. The knights will be able to let loose and enjoy themselves after weeks or even months on crusade. They will be able to relax and enjoy the company of beautiful women. And what would a medieval feast be without plenty of alcohol? There will be barrels of beer and wine flowing throughout the celebration. In fact, the wine will flow so freely that it is said that the knights will get so drunk that they will start fighting each other. But that is all part of the fun. The king wants his knights to enjoy themselves and to let off some steam. As the feast gets underway, the knights begin to arrive. There is Sir Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, who is a close friend of the king. Then there is Sir William Marshall, one of the most famous knights in English history. And then there is Sir Geoffrey de Mandeville, Earl of Essex, who is one of the richest men in England. All of these knights are important and powerful, but they are all equal in the eyes of the king. They have all fought bravely in his service, and they all deserve to be celebrated. As the knights take their places at the king's table, they are greeted by a sight that makes their mouths water. There is a boar's head in the center of the table, surrounded by dishes of roasted meat, fish, and fruit. There is also plenty of bread, cheese, and butter to go around. The feast is truly a sight to behold, and the knights dig in with gusto. After the feast, it is time for entertainment. There is a jousting tournament in which the knights compete against each other in mounted combat. There is also a falconry display in which trained falcons are used to hunt small game. The highlight of the entertainment, however, is the mock battle. The knights are divided into two teams and they battle each other with wooden swords and shields. The fight is fierce but friendly and it ends with both sides claiming victory. As the night wears on, the knights begin to relax. They drink heavily and they tell stories of their valor in battle. Sir Thomas Becket tells the story of how he slew a dragon with his bare hands. Sir William Marshall tells the story of how he rescued a damsel in distress from a wicked knight. And Sir Geoffrey de Mandeville tells the story of how he won a great victory in France. The knights are clearly enjoying themselves and the wine is flowing freely. At one point, Sir Thomas Becket gets so drunk that he starts fighting with Sir William Marshall.